Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The first thing I'd like to do is to thank the four gentlemen, five now, who are at the dais, both for their work on the behalf of the American people and as representatives of the three entities now for which they work. And I'd like for them to know how much we appreciate their work. I'd like to have them pass it on to the agents and officers into the field. It is very easy for people to be brilliant Monday morning quarterbacks after the fact when we've gone back and tried to piece everything together. But when you're in the middle of a battle, it's not always easy. Everyone agrees that mistakes were made, that things weren't done that could have been done. And in fact, some of you have indicated that was a great frustration to you. I suggest that, especially during the last decade, one of the reasons, and it's our job really to ask the reasons why, there are at least 3 or 4 reasons that our committee has begun to come up with. Obviously, everybody can make mistakes. I make about 400 a day myself, and we're never going to change human nature. We will always make mistakes. But are there systemic things that resulted in more mistakes than should have ordinarily been made? And a couple of things that we've heard from these witnesses here today point us in the right direction. One, a lack of resources. I'll get into that in a moment. And two, risk aversion due to the creation of walls and misunderstandings about authorities. And Mr. Chairman, to a large extent, policymakers, including members of the United States Congress and the executive branch, are responsible for both of those. And I'm going to get into that in a little bit too. So I just want to put that in perspective. But there are 2 preliminary things I'd like to comment on. First, I want to note that I share Senator Shelby's concerns about sensitive information being revealed in these open hearings. 2 of the witnesses have made the same point, one saying that our testimony will be studied by our enemies, and that's absolutely true. We are revealing in open session today a lot of information about how we operate, which will be very useful to our enemies. That's not good, and it's not necessary. Specifically, with respect to the witnesses before us today, they've all been interviewed by our staff, and we've had conversations with some of them as members. The story has been written. It was presented very nicely by the head of our staff here today. So this hearing is for show. This isn't to obtain information. Now, there's a point at which it's important for us to present the information that we've derived to the American people. But it should be when we're all done. And it shouldn't be in a setting in which the witnesses are having to be very careful about what they say because they may say something that's classified. The second thing I'd like to say is that there's been an implication that this committee would be a lot more effective if only the FBI and the Department of Justice and the CIA and others would just cooperate with us. And Mr. Chairman, to some extent, there may be some validity in some of that. But the other side of the story is that, as far as I know, they've been very cooperative, and to some extent, I think we're overreaching. Let me give you an example. Reading through the clips of the Arizona Republic, my home paper today, FBI agent is asked to testify publicly on Phoenix memo. And I quote the story in part. A joint House-Senate intelligence panel, that's us, is calling Phoenix-based FBI agent Kenneth Williams to testify next Thursday for the first time publicly about his July 2001 memorandum warning that potential terrorists were attending U.S. flight schools. Senate Intelligence Committee Chairman Bob Graham also says the Joint Committee is intending to release its findings on exactly what happened to that memo after it was sent to headquarters in Washington. Quote, the report is done, end quote, said Graham in an interview on Thursday. Going on down the story, Williams has already testified behind closed doors to the Senate Judiciary Committee. We already have all of the information that we can possibly get from Agent Williams. It is absolutely unnecessary to have him testify publicly. And yet this committee is making a show out of it, and the Department of Justice naturally is pushing back against that. Here is a letter dated September 17th from a representative of the Department of Justice to Chairman Graham and Goss, and I just read in part from the letter. Yesterday, the FBI learned that the Middle East television network Al Jazeera recently broadcast the name and face of at least one FBI employee, Kenneth Williams, whom the committee seeks to present as a witness in an open hearing next week. As you know, Agent Williams has been interviewed by GIC staff and has provided a closed briefing to members, 2 of them as a matter of fact. Agent Williams recently asked that his concerns be brought to the attention of the committee. His comments include concerns about the handling of his closed-door appearance before the committee's joint inquiry. And here's what he said. Reporters showed up at the front door of my residence, and my picture and personal information appeared in the national news. I can only imagine that a public session will result in even greater exposure. If the reporters could locate my residence, so could Al-Qaeda or any other terrorist organization. Then the letter proceeds. He also expressed concern for the safety of himself and his family, saying, I sincerely believe that my appearance in a public session would be detrimental to my personal safety and the safety of my family. Nonetheless, Agent Williams concludes by noting his willingness to appear again before the committee's joint inquiry in closed session to cover any issues left unresolved or that are newly developed since his last appearance. And he notes that and says he'd love to return and answer any questions we might have in closed hearing. Part of this, in other words, is theater. And, Mr. Chairman, I just can't express strongly enough that we're asking these people to put their lives on the line, and I think we'd ought to be a little bit careful about throwing around accusations that people are not cooperating with us, when part of the reason is for their own safety. Moreover, any disputes we're having about what's in the material that he produced, the so-called Phoenix Memo, we know everything we have to know about that memo, and say we, the public. The stuff that hasn't been declassified yet, nobody needs to know. It's names, dates, places that have no bearing on the ultimate issue, but are very important in the intelligence context. So I want to make that point to make it clear that there is a difference of opinion here about just what this committee ought to be doing publicly. Now let me get to the questions. As I said, it seems to me that there are two themes that derive from both our report and the witnesses who have been here. Namely, that we didn't have the resources to do what needed to be done, and secondly, there was a lot of confusion about what our legal authority was. And I just now want to quote briefly from the testimony here. First, with respect to the resource issue. This is the testimony of our CIA witness. What I will say here is that new procedures and training aside, they are also the kinds of misses, the mistakes in other words, that happen when people who are very competent, dedicated people such as CIA officers and FBI agents and analysts involved in aspects of the story are simply overwhelmed. The counterterrorism business often does not feature a large team going after a single target, but rather one or two officers juggling multiple activities against many people simultaneously trying to make sense of what it means. Which target deserves priority attention and balancing the interests of multiple stations, liaison services, and other agencies. Mr. Kojum said, just to quote one statement, the tip-off is now the primary focal point for entering intelligence community information on known or suspected terrorists into class. However, tip-off is not adequately staffed to deal with the increased workload. Talks about the small dedicated staff frequently coming in after hours and on nights and weekends and so on. In the testimony that was presented by our staff, and I'll just mention a couple of these, there are numerous references to the lack of resources. For example, on one of the statements that there were not enough people to handle CTC's workload at the time. As a result, informational cables such as the March 2000 message, which was much the subject of our discussion here, received less attention than action items. Several other employees told us that they typically did not even have time to read information cables. Another, we were told that the matter was dropped because the agent had to move on to other things. New York FBI agents told us they tried to convince FBI headquarters to open a criminal investigation on al-Midhar, given the importance of the search and the limited resources that were available to all intelligence investigations. We're going to get into that more in a little bit. I could go on and on. Let me just ask the first question here because of a comment that the CIA agent here made during his testimony. We know that while we had some contact with these people while they were in Malaysia, that thereafter there was less contact. I believe you testified, sir, that we were unable to mobilize what we needed to mobilize to remain in, that was your direct quotation, and I'll paraphrase, to remain in the kind of contact that would have been useful with those people. Is that an accurate statement of what you said?
Yes.
Is that an example of having resources stretched too thin to do the job that you'd have liked to have been able to do?
Unfortunately, not that particular instance. That was a separate reason for that. A larger part of the community wasn't able to. They were busy doing other things related to terrorism. But that's the. I think.
Well, excuse me.
Right.
When you're too busy to attend to this because you're busy focused on other things, that might suggest that you're prioritizing.
It wasn't what I'm. I guess what I'm saying is it wasn't necessarily the CIA's choice. It was not a
Okay.
U.S. choice.
Okay, and I know where you're going with that. But go ahead with the rest of what you wanted to say.
Oh, that was it.
Okay. Well, let me just ask you a general question then, whether you found occasions in which the lack of resources inhibited you from doing your job. Start with the CIA agent.
Yes. I think that, thank you. I'm not going to make a speech, I promise.
No.
The lack of resources is critical, and if I could shift the context just a tiny bit, I made mention in my testimony of 10 months of pounding in Afghanistan, and yet we still regard al-Qaeda as a threat. Before 11 September, what the United States government basically had were the overseas, offensively, were the resources of the CIA alongside the FBI in many cases. Is an intelligence problem. It's fairly clear that the director's discussion about declaring war on al-Qaeda is not something that he's empowered to do officially by the Constitution. That choice remains elsewhere. Al-Qaeda, in fact, had declared war on the United States and nearly sank a $1 billion warship in the process of doing that. What you had facing a vastly more fit al-Qaeda, in other words, were a few civilians who were as I've heard recently described, a platoon in a brigade-sized field, and doing the best they can. So yes, there was a lack of resources.
Just to any of the other witnesses, I quoted Mr. Kojum, who talked about his people being stretched pretty thin. Do any of you want to comment on this issue of resources?
Senator, I couldn't possibly let that pass. I think, as my agency colleague would attest, I spend a fair amount of time at CTC, and he spends a fair amount of time in our headquarters for a lot of different reasons, part of which are competing priorities, but a big part of which is in the year 2000, the year 2001, the FBI was not allowed to hire to attrition. We have more agents and man-hours walking out the door than we have coming in, and you don't have to do the math to figure out that at some point in time that's going to have a deleterious effect on all your criminal investigations as well as your counterintelligence and counterterrorism investigations. The support people in particular who've worked these attacks, and I think it's important to put into context not just the past 3.5 years, but we've talked about the Africa Embassy bombings. If you start there, the same people responsible for investigating the Africa Embassy bombings and then on to the deployment of Kosovo and the downing of Egypt Air, neither of which were terrorism, but it got handed to us. You work on up through the fall and the build up to the millennium. You have people who literally are, as someone told me, just learn to work tired, and I saw it every single day. And I cannot pass up the opportunity to commend them and to state for the record, for us, the American people, how much credit they deserve for this fight. They go months at a time without time off, long nights, long weekends, holidays, etc., without a single complaint by any of them. You roll then on into the Millennium event, and it's another month without time off. And this is pertinent to the discussion today because there is a tremendous effort underway to try to figure out whether or not Ahmed Rassam is tied to some other network, or is this the kind of problem we're going to have to deal with in the future. And there's a hand-in-hand effort between the Bureau and the agency and others around the world to try to figure that out. We now know that that was going to coincide with serious attacks in Jordan and the attack on the USS the Sullivans within a very short time frame, which would have stretched our resources incredibly. But they're patient. This is what they do for a living. So 10 months later, 17 sailors die when they find the opportunity to attack the USS Cole. So you have all of those investigations, and then leading on up into 9/11, being worked by an increasingly depleted supply of analysts, officers, agents, and managers. There are fewer FBI agents assigned on 9/11 worldwide to the terrorism problem than there were the week of the Africa Embassy bombings. The director has noted that, he's corrected that, and we're going in the right direction. But I just think it's important to put that in context. And if I could say one more thing, we talk about bin Laden and we move forward from September 11, or I'm sorry, from the embassy bombings. Don't forget about the people who died in ones and twos. Don't forget about our soldiers, our airmen who died at Kobar Towers, the Marines in the barrack bombing, Zach Hernandez, who died in Panama because he was an American soldier. Don't forget about the victims of 17 November that has gone on for decades without resolution until recently, or the Americans kidnapped by Abu Sayyaf and killed, and the Americans kidnapped by the FARC and killed. In addition to all that, 5 of your 7 state sponsors' counterintelligence responsibilities fall to that same international terrorism operations section. They're working tired, and they're doing a heck of a job.
I appreciate that very much, and if very briefly,
yes, sir.
The others on the panel would like to come in, because I do want to go to the next subject. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. From a field agent's perspective, I could probably talk for an hour on resources. The comment in there is mainly due to the fact that criminal resources and criminal agents, it's so manpower intensive, and with the possibility of somebody being let go because you missed something with regards to one of the trials, unfortunately, our managers, I can only try to comprehend their job. They try to leverage our assets as best as they can. So most of the manpower ends up falling on criminal agents as opposed to intelligence. Pragmatically, when I stress that to headquarters, it was just as a matter of being pragmatic. This is how I know it's going to work, just because of the fact that our intelligence investigators were absolutely overworked. Less weekends off than I myself probably had in the last few years. But
and this is one of the reasons we're trying to, or some people are trying to move the investigation into the criminal area from the New York office on Midhar, because of the greater resources in the criminal area than in the investigative area. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. I would say a couple weeks later, when we were, after everything happened and we had ramped up, where thousands of FBI agents all over the world were trying to find somebody, I thought to myself, and I don't necessarily know how to do it, but we got to be able to get there. When we find out a Khalid al-Midhar is in the country, intelligence, criminal, or whatever, we got to be able to get to the level we were at September 12th, the afternoon of September 11th, we got to be able to get there before September 11th, not a September 12th.
Let me go right to this, and I'm obviously going to be able to, or not be able to get into the second area that I wanted to, but this is important. Mr. Rolnice, I think this question is for you, because in your opening statement, you talked about the desire to go to a criminal investigation, but you said we did not have specific credible evidence of criminal activity to do so. My question really is whether, and that's FBI information, but what about the CIA? If you had had if the CIA had been able to convey to you the information that they had, would that perhaps have sufficed to enable you to begin a criminal investigation?
I'm not necessarily sure that it would, sir, only because in order to open that criminal investigation, that, just as a counterintelligence investigation, is regulated by Attorney General guidelines. And what we have, to the best of my knowledge, is an individual, 2 individuals of great interest to us at a meeting with another individual that you tied to the Cole. Can you make the inference that they're tied to it as well? Given what these people do for a living, you can probably suppose that, but I'm not sure that suffices to be specific and credible enough. With that said, and in somewhat of a disagreement with my colleague, resources in the New York office are larger than the resources anywhere else in the country, to include counterintelligence resources. So it's a matter of
that was the headquarters for the terrorist investigation, wasn't it?
It's a matter of management allotting resources in accordance with the importance of the case. It's as simple as that.
Well, and believe me, I'm not criticizing anybody for the management of what they have, but as my colleagues here on the dais will attest, every time we go someplace and ask, is there anything else we can do for you, inevitably one of the things is, well, we could always use more help. But was part of the problem here the fact that the CIA information could not be given to the FBI because of the wall? I mean, your testimony is that these restrictions limited the free flow of information. You couldn't even, for lead purposes, transfer that or get that information transferred over to you.
Sir, if I could comment on that real quick, because I was part of the conversation trying to get this information downgraded. What we will do is, FBI agents wear both hats, intel and criminal. Depending on what's given to us, we try to do whatever we can, even when we're on the criminal side, and we can go into more detail of that in a closed committee hearing. But with regards to that, what our attempt would have been, and it might have been struck down, and even if it had all gone through, we might not have ever found Midhar beforehand, was to go to the CIA, have this information downgraded, take what we knew criminally from the Cole, then go to a judge and say, this is what we have, Judge. Can you help us out here? You know, we'll swear out what we know.
In other words, at least try to
do it. And that was the main impetus behind going to them, or at least bringing up the conversation of having certain information downgraded, realizing that we were in a exigent circumstance and this individual had come into the country.
Right. Well, I'll just conclude by saying that we need to get into this whole question of the risk aversion due to the either real or imagined walls, or I shouldn't say imagined, but either proper understandings or misunderstandings about the application of the laws under which both FBI and CIA operated, and the confusion and misunderstandings that resulted from that, and perhaps in some cases the inability to pursue things that might have been productive had they been pursued.
Could I request a minute just to address this one issue, because it's come up about 4 times just as the light has gone red, and I'd really like to just address it just for a second for the process part of it. The New York meeting, as I think it's become clearer through the Joint Inquiry staff, every place that something could have gone wrong in this over a year and a half, it went wrong. All the processes have been put in place, all the safeguards, everything else, they failed at every possible opportunity. Nothing went right. In this particular case, and that's one of the reasons why they have an exchange program at the management level between the FBI and CIA, is when there's an issue like this, there are usually procedures for getting the information cleared rapidly. And as part of what was going on in the Cole investigation at that time, there was some other information not pertaining to photos, not pertaining specifically to Midhar and Hazmi, but pertaining to Malaysia, that the FBI was attempting to get cleared to use in their interviews of various persons who could help them with the Cole investigation. And what the agency was trying to do was to get that stuff cleared, was to get it in a position where it could be used. What we were also, I believe, trying to do through that summer that culminated in kind of the rediscovery of the thing in July, was to stimulate the dialogue between the FBI and CIA on this issue. And normally, and again, nothing normal happened, but normally what happens is if there runs into a conversation block where you have to stop, then you take steps to get it cleared. And then it moves on. So there was no, so the reluctance to pass the information and to, was not a deliberate thing. It was, A, we didn't know if we knew at the time, so all of the information that could have been passed wasn't because we hadn't done it. But also, there was a movement to get it cleared to pass. It just didn't complete. Thank you. Thank you very much.